Success in collaboration is dependent on the extent people are able to cross the threshold from feeling like outsiders to feeling like insiders. This threshold cannot be crossed though when there are many common barriers to collaboration still standing. These common barriers to collaboration can be grouped into four categories: social, physical, spiritual, and psychological. Social barriers are constructed from our cultural framework, interpersonal relationships, and social beliefs. Cultural frameworks give guidance to understand where people are coming from. This is represented by the ideals, beliefs, skills, tools, customs, and institutions that each individual holds to or identifies with. Understanding the cultural framework is important because culture has an active role in shaping, defining, directing, and creating knowledge. The knowledge and interactions each person brings to the proverbial table in collaboration is viewed through each individual's cultural lens, and so it can be valued, discarded, or misinterpreted. Cultural framework is formed by language, cultural cues, and cultural beliefs. Interpersonal relationships give guidance on how people interact with one another. How interactions take place reveal the openness, acceptance, and trust within the relationship. These interpersonal relationships are affected by leadership, hierarchy, and relational roadblocks. Social beliefs are what outside forces are placing pressure on the outcome of the collaboration process. These forces can come in the form of political and social climate, and can be real or perceived. But either way, they must be taken seriously. Understanding where people come from, how they interact, and what outside forces are placing pressure on the collaboration process will allow for the deconstruction of these social barriers.
Hello. Collaboration is based on building relationships, and relationships between varying churches and ministry organizations can be just as cold as the temperature is outside. If churches are going to be involved in a collaborative effort, the theological and doctrinal barriers must be considered. The first category of doctrinal barriers is denominational distinctives. What does a church's denomination have to do with anything? For some, everything. In some denominations, secondary separation is a strong tenet of their faith practice. This distinctive effectively places any of its churches outside the realm of interdenominational collaboration. The second category is core doctrines or foundational doctrines, such as the deity of Christ and inerrancy of Scripture. Then there are social and moral doctrines. What are the various stands on issues such as homosexuality and alcohol use? The last area of theology and doctrine that poses barriers is the personal beliefs of the leadership, their standards, their personal convictions, modesty issues, and yes, even Bible translations. One thing to keep in mind, everyone in their theological thinking has a biblical basis for what they believe. It does not matter if you agree with that stand or not. It is a matter of perspective. Only when we understand the perspective of the other can we begin to open doors for collaboration. Speaking of doors, I have to get back working on this one.
When we talk about physical barriers to collaboration, we're talking about those things that exist in the material world. For example, geography. Often the simple problem of distance can present significant problems to a collaborative effort. An increase in distance or other geographic barrier corresponds to an increase in the time and resources that it takes to collaborate effectively. This issue can be exacerbated in rural areas, for example, since they tend to be poorer, more sparsely populated, have greater distances between population centers, and are without adequate forms of public transportation. Geographic issues also force potential collaborators to rely more heavily on technological solutions, which, while certainly helpful and becoming more helpful, still are not the best or cheapest way to achieve good collaboration. In addition to geography, there are economic factors that work to hinder collaboration. Economic disparities tend to isolate and insulate people from each other. You can see this phenomenon if you examine any large city and its surrounding suburbs. Look at this graphic of Buffalo, New York that shows the median household income in Buffalo. The colors are in $25,000 per year increments, with the lightest being the least annual income, and the darkest sections being anything over $100,000 per year. As you can see, there are clear groupings. Economic groups tend to be isolated and insulated from each other. Shane Claiborne, the poverty activist and founder of The Simple Way, likes to illustrate this principle like this. He said, Jesus said, "The poor you will always have with you." But his question is, are the poor with you? Do you really know any poor people? Another common economic factor that can hinder collaboration is the mentality of scarcity. This is the idea that there are finite amounts of resources available. In other words, if whatever I get in terms of resources means that someone down the street, the youth pastor, the organization down the street, can't have that, and vice versa. This mentality of scarcity can be a major obstacle to working with other individuals and organizations.
A coalition involves two or more organizations working together around an issue or a common set of interrelated issues that can't be addressed on their own. The purpose is to harness enough influence and resources to have an impact on an issue beyond the grasp of one group alone. However, there are two important psychological issues that hinder successful collaboration. The first one is trust. Trust is a mutual respect, a valuing of differences in others, and a willingness to accept those involved in the collaboration process. But what does trust do? Number one, trust gets everyone to the table. Separately, we don't have the power to resolve a problem, but because they are all tied together, we trust others that have the talents, the goals, the giftings to bring us all together. Secondly, trust also emphasizes common interest than our differences. Becoming more aware of our similarities along with the cultural differences doesn't have to paralyze or divide us. Through common interests, we can know how to translate different from me or less than me into things like things that are like me in important ways. As a result, trust becomes less of a barrier to effectiveness. Trust also makes it easier for effective communication among others. Understanding how other people communicate is the first step toward understanding and respecting each other. It also enriches everyone's life when there is shared knowledge that we can trust, and we can share that knowledge and that resources with others. It also creates community. As our population becomes more culturally diverse, some culture groups are even experiencing more problems than others. But if we learn to value those cultures as our neighbors instead of our adversaries, trust begins to grow, and we have a vested interest in this collaboration process. The second mental or psychological barrier is our lack of commitment toward a successful collaboration process. Many times it is because of our past, how we were raised, or even the culture that we live in breed this type of mental negative attitude. Some of the reasons why proper mental attitude or more commitment needs to be used when collaborating. Number one, realizing that those affected by the problem are not participating in the solution. This could mean that God has called us to be that solution because of our gifting, our resources, or our calling. When we realize that God who has called us toward a successful collaboration, this negative mental attitude dissipates. Number two, there is more at stake than our individual agendas. When we come face to face with this usually corrects our attitude. And lastly, there are problems among many diverse groups that one organization cannot solve alone. Because of our lack of commitment or wrongful attitude, we soon realize that a bad situation can get worse if nothing is done. When we begin to listen actively and emphatically, and when we try to put ourselves in other people's shoes, especially in another person's, when they have different ideas or perspectives, really different from our own, our commitment level goes up. When these two psychological barriers are finally overcome, there is a desire to identify others involved in the problem and to bring them to the table. Everyone in the table will share a vision and be committed to the process of reaching out to new partners and having a successful collaboration process.